Hello, my name is Alexandra Manueli. I'm the digital content editor at Global Food Safety Resource. Today I'm speaking with Susie Hoeller. Susie is an international business attorney currently based in Tampa, Florida. She counsels businesses, including food and beverage companies, on regular compliance, and she negotiates contracts and intellectual property licenses. She serves as an advisor to GFSR and New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. Today, we're going to be speaking about the impact of the coronavirus on food safety workers and their legal rights and responsibilities. So, Susie, this is a very hot topic. It's a constantly changing topic, but today it's March 20th. From what we know at this moment, we've been hearing governments speak about the need to deem members of the food supply chain essential personnel in order to keep those supply chains moving in this time of need. From a legal perspective, what are employees' rights and their responsibilities if they become ill due to this pandemic?
That's a perfect question to start off our discussion with. The employers in democratic countries have a duty under local laws and international laws to keep their workplaces safe from what are called known hazards. So that's very simple in the context of, say, a forklift truck, or making sure that there's not liquids on the floor or toxic chemicals in the air from industrial processes. In this case, it's much more tricky because we're dealing with an invisible pathogen, and we know from what the World Health Organization and the governments have said is that people that aren't visibly sick can pass this pathogen, coronavirus, onto other people. So that makes it very difficult for employers to know exactly what to do. But simple steps that employers are taking right now are increased sanitation. And of course, the food industry, under laws in most countries, have very strict sanitation requirements already, but they're upping that. They also are using a lot more personal protective gear than in the past, assuming that's available, but goggles, masks, protective physical equipment. So the employees have a right under the law to a safe workplace, but this situation is extremely different or more dangerous. So there's not an absolute right in one sense. The employers can't achieve perfection, but they have to take reasonable steps with the information that's known and being issued by governmental authorities. And in some cases, as you know, that means closing facilities, which is what we don't want to do with food production, for sure.
So some of those reasonable steps might be protective goggles or gloves. We've seen in extreme cases governments like checking to see whether someone has a fever. Is that something that would be too extreme in your opinion?
No, I think that's a good idea, and a lot of employers are doing that. They're checking people with these thermometers before they come in. Certainly, the employees have a right to know in most jurisdictions. We can't talk about every jurisdiction, but generally speaking, and I'm talking about Western-style democracies, the employer should be telling the other workers if somebody has come down with this horrible virus. They have a right to know that. And that's something that any employment lawyer would tell their client. Look, you can't hide it. If somebody has it, you have to tell people so that people know that and they can take whatever steps they want. The issue, though, with essential workers is essential workers typically have to stay on the job even if there's an element of danger. So this is well known for police, fire, emergency medical, even in some cases sanitation workers, garbage collection, because if you don't pick up garbage over a period of time, you're going to have other outbreaks. But it's very interesting. The United Nations International Labor Organization defines a whole set of essential services, which I mentioned, fire, police, but they don't mention food workers. That's a huge oversight, and that I think should be corrected going forward. Really, in our societies, the food workers have been ignored. They're not really treated properly. Now, that's what ethical employers treat them really well. organizations like GFSR that's educating people or, supporting food workers. But a lot of people have taken them for granted. And now that there's a fear of the food supply, food security, now everybody's thinking about them being essential workers, but they haven't really been defined that way, at least by the International Labor Organization as of today. And that should change in the future.
Absolutely. Those are some really good points. The EFSA has assured us that the coronavirus does not spread through food, which is good news for us to hear. But yet some factories require really close contacts, I think, as you were kind of alluding to earlier in your response. What are some legal responsibilities for those in upper management to ensure that a potential outbreak doesn't occur in one of those facilities?
Well, one thing they can do, like for example, as you know, some food production facilities, I'm talking about producing facilities, we're not talking right this minute about field workers picking crops or people handling livestock, live livestock, like cattle ranchers and things. But in a lot of food manufacturing facilities are highly automated. There's not that many people that are really involved. So in those cases, it's not such a hard situation. But in certain things, like for example, poultry processing, there's a lot of workers on the line. So I think what employers need to think about doing is maybe their production has to go lower, and because they separate the workers. It may be that they just have to, separate the workers. They don't get as much production every minute on the line, but maybe they run it 24/7, where in the past, before this came, they maybe were only running it on a day or evening shift. So they certainly have to do whatever they can to separate the workers. But it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be 100% possible in every situation. So in that case, then they really need to be working for protective equipment. But the problem they have is a lot of that's in short supply right now. Even hospitals aren't getting it, protective equipment in some areas. So it's really a very, very difficult position. Now, some companies that are really on the cutting edge already have pandemic outbreak emergency plans. The sophisticated companies know that pandemics happen. They've seen H1N1 a few years ago, the SARS that was 20 years ago. So they know that that's out there, so they have plans. Companies that don't have plans, they're scrambling. And you have the issue of, can a worker just say, an employee just say, I'm going to stay home. I'm worried about my family if I get sick. And the issue in, like, say, example, Canada and the US, for example, is we have freedom of employment. In other words, the government, unless you're a government employee working for the government, if you're in the private sector, we have freedom of employment. The government isn't telling us to go to law school or medical school or become an advertising person or food safety specialist. We have freedom of employment. So that's very tricky when you're talking about private industries forcing their employees to work if the employees don't want to come in. Now, what could happen if this got very bad? Right now they're saying the food supply is okay, but if it got worse, God forbid, then maybe there would be emergency declarations by state or provincial or other other countries' administrative areas to say, we're now creating an emergency order. These people are essential workers and we're going to force them to work. I think that would be very, that would have to be in the most dire circumstances for that to happen. Because right now, in the only people that can be forced to work in most of these countries that are democratically run countries are people that are actually government employees that are deemed essential. Again, the police, the fire, the emergency medical, doctors, nurses, hospital workers. So the definition after this pandemic, it's clear that the definition of essential workers has to broaden to deal with the food industry and all, from field to production. And one big issue too is, what about the truck drivers? I mean, we might have all this food production, but if we don't have people willing to drive the trucks or, deal with a lot of its railroads, but getting it to stores as trucks, they don't usually have railroads going right into a store. So you need trucks. If the truckers start falling sick or not wanting to come in, that's going to be a big problem. But hopefully, most people in most of these situations are heroic and they are willing to step up and help people. So I think we'll we'll get through it. I'm basically an optimist about this. There'll always be people that are going to be selfish, like the ones that are hoarding food and toilet paper and things like that in the stores. Now, those are selfish people, but they're the minority. Most people do care about not just their own family, but they care about their neighbors and the community as a whole.
Yeah, I do think that we're seeing some really great examples of people who are, and especially in the food industry, people who are stepping up and, making the effort to work the extra hours. I just heard a wonderful story of Boer meats making runs on Saturdays and Sundays when they typically do not make those runs because the store shelves have been completely emptied. So I know that there are, people really making the effort in the food industry. But you mentioned that you've heard of companies that have these kind of extraordinary pandemic plans. Are there any that you might be able to highlight for us?
Well, I don't want to say because of, let's say, attorney
Sure, of course.
confidentiality, but I could say just generally, the larger the company is, the more likely that it has a pandemic plan because it has more resources. It has a big risk department. It has a larger occupational health and safety department. Doesn't mean that small companies can't have these plans, but so I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying a lot of times larger companies have more resources to put together plans. And one thing too, a lot of companies are repurposing their production. For example, it's been on the news that a lot of distilleries, instead of producing alcohol for drinking for bars, are reproducing it for hand sanitizer. And so I could see that in the food industry too. Some companies repurposing, saying, maybe we don't need this type of more pleasure food. I'm not going to use the word junk food because I don't need to be casting aspersions, but you know what I'm saying? They might say, hey, we might change it to produce something that's more of a staple than a luxury food. We're going to change our production to produce more staples as opposed to luxury foods. So we're seeing that with the distilleries saying, okay, we're not going to make as much alcohol to drink. We're going to turn it in for hand sanitizers. And interestingly, you mentioned at the beginning, I happen to be living right now in Tampa Bay area, and Publix is the main grocery store in Florida. And I was there on Monday picking up some supplies, and I made, not bragging, I'm not talking about myself, but I went out of my way to tell every public associate and the people that were stocking, there was a gentleman stocking Frito-Lay chips. I said to them, thank you very much for working when the government's saying, stay home, people are afraid, and you're all working. So I wrote a letter to the editor of the newspaper here, and it got published. And the store manager contacted me and said that he had put the letter up on the bulletin board so that the employees could see that, customers, this was just one example, but customers really do care and do appreciate the efforts that they're making. And he told me how tired the people were because they've just been working, like you just said, longer hours. But they're out there, they're wanting to make sure that everybody has food. And so it's terrific.
Yeah, that is a really beautiful story. And though I do want to bring it back to a bit more of a, not a serious note, but a bit more of a dire note, I guess, when the dust settles and when, we see the light at the end of the tunnel, when people are emerging from this pandemic, from your standpoint in international law, do you think that there will be consequences for those who may have neglected to do what was necessary, and who there has been so many economic and social ramifications and damages, I guess you could say. So would you say that there's going to be an international body or something of the sort that will call some sort of due process on this whole thing in the end?
Yes, I think so, and I think it might be led by the World Health Organization. You're speaking about countries holding countries responsible, right?
Yes.
For example, like China,
Yes.
covered it up. That's a fact. It's not being racist or being mean about China. The Chinese government covered this up, and the doctor who was trying to bring it out, was punished, and then he died, sadly, treating his patients. So I think there will be, well, one repercussion that's happening right now is in the United States, there's bills in Congress right now to pull pharmaceuticals out of China. In other words, to say we're not going to have our pharmaceutical ingredients or pharmaceuticals made in China anymore after this happened. So I think there's going to be a huge impact on China. A lot of people that have a supply chain there are going to say, we can't trust the Chinese government. This is not a reflection on the Chinese people. They're the victims of this, obviously. So I think there will be repercussions. I think you could see lawsuits for damages. Some of this would be new, but the law is always evolving to meet new circumstances. And there are treaties that relate to, for example, if you're in the UN and other international bodies, World Trade Organization, there's rules and regulations that you're supposed to abide by. So countries that don't do that certainly can be held liable in damage lawsuits. So then the question is always how do you collect damages? But certainly countries have been sued, and they'll say that they have sovereign immunity, which is legalese, but you can't sue the crown or the government. But I think you'll see for sure this is going to very, very much hurt China's. Right before this happened, China was the manufacturing center for the world, right? Mm-hmm. Most manufacturing going on here, and that was already starting to change with the Trump administration tariffs. But I think that's going to be accelerated now. So what goes around comes around. When you do bad things, you may not get caught, get the slap on your hand right away, but it's going to happen. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a very good question, and I do think that you will see more countries say, you know what, we need to have our own masks, our own respirators, our own protective gear. Mm-hmm. Why are we having all these masks made overseas and now we can't get them? But this is a respiratory pandemic. There could be pandemics related to digestive. There's other viruses and bacteria. So this is respiratory, but there could be other medical supplies that people need to start thinking about. What if everybody gets a digestive virus? That can be really horrendous as well. So I think there's going to be a lot more. The other thing too, what I've seen is a lot of people they should have been, but they weren't that concerned about Ebola because they thought, oh, that's in Africa. It doesn't affect us. A couple of people came over, but they didn't really care. I think now that this is in every country in the world almost, I think you're going to see people say, you know what? We need to care about other people. It's not just our country. I mean, our country needs to protect its citizens. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying, but we need to cooperate with the world, and we need to make it better so that we do care if there's an outbreak, even if it's far away. Because in the age of air travel, unless you cut off air travel, you can't stop these things from going around the world. And that's what we've seen with this. And the thing is, it happens so quickly.
Well, hopefully this, encourages people to take these viruses more seriously and take our healthcare more seriously, and encourages funding in these matters a bit more seriously. And also, I think that this will hopefully encourage governments to consider the food supply chain and workers in the food supply chain, take them and their responsibilities a bit more seriously as well. So thank you so much for speaking with me, Susie. It was truly a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Alexandra. Thank you.